driving me this morning? All the speakers on it? Okay, well, I'm just going to talk loud. Sorry for the people on the live stream that can't hear me. You can just read my lips and I'll enunciate really well. How about that? I want to start in Numbers chapter 33, the end of the chapter. We'll kind of use this to develop some context for us. But I want to talk to you first about an event that happened in the late 1800s. Some of you from Oklahoma, my Oklahoma crew's not here this morning. I planned this for them. But anyways, I want to talk to you about an event that happened in Oklahoma in the late 1800s. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. The Oklahoma Land Rush. Anybody ever heard about that in the late 1800s? Yeah. So that was a series of events in the late 1800s where the government basically, they had claimed this Indian territory and they opened up about 2 million acres for people to claim. But in order for them to claim it, they had specific days where they basically line you up on the start line, fire a gun and say, go and take it. And so in order to claim this property, you had to get there, you had to stake your claim on it, and you had to fight off everybody else. And as you can imagine, they had several rounds of this. Every time that they did it, just chaos ensued. I mean, people are out there, it's a free-for-all, trampling one another because I'm going to get there before you do. There's people, they get to these different land plots and they start fighting over them. And it was just a real bizarre, wonky situation. It kind of makes you wonder, what was the government thinking? Of course, we ask that a lot these days, don't we? But what happened in the wake of the Oklahoma Land Rush was it really set that territory up for a lot of chaos and disorder. There wasn't very centralized government. There was not clear leadership. There wasn't clear structure of boundaries. And it was kind of just the Wild West out there in Oklahoma. And it still kind of is today, isn't it? And so that was not a very well thought out event. Because the fact is, on a very basic human level, people left to their own devices going after something that they want, they're not going to act very nice, are they? Now, I wanted to start thinking about this because the conquest of Canaan had the potential to be like this. You ever thought about that? Here is a group of millions of people who are now going to be dividing up about 300,000 square miles of land. And as they've started the conquest, some of the tribes are already looking at the property saying, I think I like that one. You remember Reuben and Gad, even before they cross the Jordan, they come to Moses, they say, hey, we like this property. Let us have this as our inheritance. And I'm sure as they're going through and they're conquering different parts of the land of Canaan, I mean, if it was me, I'd be going, I like this one. I think I want to lay claim here, in the back of your mind, kind of formulating, how do I get what I want? It has potential to be a very divisive thing, doesn't it? But wouldn't you know that God, who knows the condition of humanity and knows the hearts of humans, He'd already set a plan in place to mitigate all of this before they got into the land of Canaan. That's why we're here in Numbers chapter 33. This is God speaking to Moses, beginning in verse number 50. And the Lord spoke to Moses in the plains of Moab, by the Jordan at Jericho, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you pass over the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall drive out all the inhabitants of the land from before you, and destroy all their figured stones, and destroy all their metal images, and demolish all their high places. And you shall take possession of the land, and settle in it, for I have given the land to you to possess. You shall inherit the land by lot, according to your clans. To a large tribe you shall give a large inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a small inheritance. Wherever the lot falls for anyone, that shall be his. According to the tribes of your fathers you shall inherit. And so, in line with God's character of being a God of order and not a God of chaos, we see Him directing His people with harmony, with direction, with purpose. So they will inherit when they get into the land of Canaan. They will inherit by lot. The larger tribes are going to get larger lands. The smaller tribes are going to get smaller lands. It's going to be divided up fairly by the size of the tribe. And just after this, look page or two over in your Bible, Numbers chapter 34. Just after this, Moses would command Joshua to head up this process. Numbers 34, beginning in verse number 16. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, these are the names of the men who shall divide the land to you for your inheritance. Eleazar the priest, and Joshua the son of Nun. You shall take one chief from every tribe to divide the land for an inheritance. And as we get into Joshua chapter 14, that's exactly what we see happening. We see Joshua continuing to be the faithful leader that he is, bringing the people into the land and divvying up the inheritance. Joshua 14 and verse number 1, these are the inheritances that the people of Israel received in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the fathers' houses of the tribes of the people gave them to inherit. I wanted to start in this place because it demonstrates something very clearly to us about God. One, that he's a God of order, right? God is never a God of chaos. We learned that all the way back from the beginning. But God cares about his people doing things in an orderly way. He cares about unity, right? He didn't want this nation at the very onset to be bickering and fighting about land. I mean, that would have potential to destroy the nation from the very get-go, right? They finally come into the land, and now they're fighting about who owns what property. In fact, sadly, within a generation, they're actually going to start doing some of it. But God initially set them up to have peace and to have harmony. He has a plan for his people to receive exactly what they need and to keep from fighting with one another about trivial issues. That's the kind of God that we are talking about, the kind of God that we follow and that we serve. He cares about his people having order. And if we will follow his plans and his patterns, we may not have the forethought and the foresight to see its impact on us, but God does. And that's why we're people of patterns, people of order, people of structure. See, this is so fundamental. It's ingrained to everything that God does for his people. So I wanted us to think about that as we begin looking at the inheritance that are given today. Now, our study today, just a heads up, if you read ahead, you know, today's study spans 9 chapters. And I don't intend to get into the weeds of it because there's a lot of stuff here. Right, the cities and the boundaries and all of those things. And if you read it, you know it's a bit cumbersome. But I want you to appreciate with me this morning as we begin to think about the inheritances that are given. I want you to think about what this section of Scripture would have meant to Israel, to the people of God, to the ones that had been promised, to your descendants I will give this land. And I'm going to give you a land of your own for you to possess. What Joshua 13 through 21 shows us and really is for the people of Israel, this is God's will and gift to them. I am giving you this land very specifically, and it shows us that he gives them the land that he promised, and this is a land of their own. And it's very clearly defined, and they get to possess it because God promised them that they would. And if you did your questions, I asked you there on question number 5, what did the law say about these boundaries? What were they supposed to do or not do with these boundaries once they were set? Right? They weren't supposed to move them. And you know, it's mentioned several times in the law. Don't move the ancient boundary. And it's almost kind of as an aside, and we read that and we go, well, what's the big deal? The point of that as a law is God is saying, I gave you this. This is yours. Don't go trying to take more. Don't go trying to manipulate the system. What I give you is exactly what you need. God is always good in fulfilling his promises and giving people what they need. And again, this was a very systematic and fair and unifying process. And so I just want to throw up here on the board for us to look at. I don't have a lot of slides this morning. This is kind of how this section documents the giving of the inheritances. First, you start off with God reminding them of their promises. And we're going to come back and put some meat on these bones and look at the details here in just a minute. But God, he starts with his promises, and I want you to notice he ends this section by reminding them of his promises, saying, I fulfilled my promises. That's what kind of clumps all of this stuff together. And then we get into talking about the eastern inheritance. Again, this is the land outside of Canaan that the Reubenites and the Gadites, if you remember the story from Numbers chapter 32, they had defeated Sihon and Og, those giant kings of the Amorites. And those two brothers said, hey, this is some really good pasture land, and we got a lot of herds. We'd like to stay over here. And so Moses granted them to have this eastern inheritance. And as we get into Joshua, if you remember Joshua chapter 1, it actually already brought this up. Joshua had to talk to these tribes and say, I know that you already have your inheritance given, but you need to come finish this conquest with us because this is all part of us fulfilling God's promises together. And so they did. if you remember that. But now at this point, they fulfilled their commitment to the land, or to the nation, rather. And so this comes back to the forefront, and that's part of the reason I think it's talked about first is they fulfilled their obligation. They want to go home. They want to get settled. And I think that's what everybody kind of wants to do at this point in the book of Joshua. And so it recounts the eastern inheritance. We'll talk about that more. And then it gets into talking about the western inheritance, everything that is in the land of Canaan, that we saw them conquer over the last couple of weeks. We'll notice today that Judah and Joseph's sons are given the first inheritances. Those are the largest nation, or the largest tribes of the nation. Again, Moses. What did Moses say? The ones that are the largest, they get the biggest land space, and that's what we're going to see. And then after they've been allotted, Joshua calls the remaining 7.5 tribes. They view it, they divide it. It's a very awesome process. And then afterward, Joshua is actually given his own inheritance. If we have time, we'll talk about that. I think that's an important part of this story. God doesn't just give to the tribes. He makes sure that the people who have stood up for him and stood out for him, they're given special inheritances of their own to continue to go and take. And then two other things that we're going to talk about this morning. If we have time, you can notice the cities of refuge that are talked about here. Those cities were a means of fairness and justice throughout the land, kind of a visible means of what God expected his people to be and to do as they became this new nation. And then we'll kind of finish up by talking about the land for the Levites. If you remember, the Levites were not given specific inheritances, although they were given some places to live. But again, this all is drawn together by Joshua 21, and I want you to flip over there with me and just read this, because this really sets the tone for how we are supposed to read these inheritances. Joshua 21, verse 43 through 45 are a summary, essentially, of the conquest of the book of Joshua. This is a verse, I believe, that the whole book has been driving us towards. So verse number 43, thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers. And they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. And so as we're studying today, I just want you to think about it through that lens. Obviously, there were some blunders on the people's part that we've talked about. But it was never God's unfaithfulness that kept them from inheriting the promises. They were able to take hold of the promises of God because God remained faithful. Now, I want to start back in Joshua chapter 13. Look at just a couple of details that are given as we begin. So as the inheritance begins, verse number 13, now Joshua was old and advanced in years. I mean, we had talked about how this conquest had taken 7 years, and we'll find out a little bit later that Caleb was about 85 about this time. I'm not sure exactly how old Joshua was. He died at 110, so he became a very old man. But at this point, it says he was old and he was advanced in years. I think given what chapter 13, verses 1 through 7 teach us, we're intended to see, Joshua's kind of getting to his retirement years, I guess is the way we could put it. He's not going to be leading Israel anymore. He's not going to be the one leading them into battle. And yet, one of the things that God says whenever he comes to him, the Lord says, you are old and advanced in years, and yet there remains very much land to possess. And he goes and he lists out all of this land, and kind of the implication from God is, you're not going to be the one leading them into the land to possess it. But God makes a very profound and important promise at the end of this. So he lists out all of this land that's yet to be possessed. And look down at the middle of verse number 6. God says, I myself will drive them out from before the people of Israel. Only allot the land to Israel for an inheritance as I have commanded you. You think about, just like with Moses, there may have been some anxiety. As the nation has moved into this land, there might be some anxiety about who's going to be our next leader, because up to this point, Joshua doesn't really have a right-hand man, does he? I mean, when Moses was leading, Joshua was that guy, but who is Joshua's right-hand man? We're not really told who that is. And I think some of that is intentional, and I think that's part of the reason God shows up here and is reminding them, it doesn't really matter who the head is, who's leading you. What matters is, I am your God. I've given you this land to possess, and I'm going to continue to do that. I like the way one writer put it, and they said, the mortality of human leadership never handicaps the everlasting God. And so God shows up, and what does he say? I'm going to continue to drive them out, regardless of who the leader is. But you got to continue to remain faithful. As we've seen, that means from God, whenever he says, I'm going to drive these people out, that doesn't mean God's people get to sit on their hands, right? You remember the story of Jericho. You remember the story of Ai. You remember the whole conquest. They are involved every step of the way, but God is with them doing the fighting. I think this detail becomes important as we see Israel's kind of subtle failure throughout the conquest. And I ask you, as you read through this section, what subtle failure did you see repeated as they're talking about these inheritances? This was question number 1 on your worksheet.
Not taking out the people that were told to take out.
That's right.
Even in this chapter.
It's interesting. They've worked so hard. They've been so diligent, right? Last week when we studied about the southern and the northern conquest, they're wiping everybody out just like they're supposed to. But then they get to this time when they're starting to settle, and it's like they'd stop doing that, right? There's at least 5 or 6 verses here scattered throughout these inheritance that remind us that they didn't continue to do that. Why do you think they stopped? Why would they not keep wiping out the people like they were supposed to? There's some implications in the text, but I'm curious.
I think human nature to get complacent when somebody else in your life is doing the heavy lifting.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's a good point. They'd come to just expect, God's going to take care of this, and we don't have to be completely obedient to it, right? Yeah, perhaps that was it. Yeah, what else?
I can't remember where, but I think when I was reading this, there were some of the inhabitants they did not drive out, but became their slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's right.
they wanted someone to do their work.
Yeah, perhaps they saw it as a strategic move, right? Yeah. Hey, if we don't wipe these people out, we can have them, take out the trash and stuff. We don't have to do that stuff. For them, it makes sense, right? In the moment, it makes sense. And it's more humane, perhaps, than slaughtering them. I don't know. I'm thinking from a purely human perspective here. Yeah.
Just going along with what Jamie said, there's references in Judges that, they allowed these people to be their slaves, but they also didn't tear down their idols.
That's right.
And so, the religious cleansing of, tearing down the gods and stuff did not happen like it should have happened.
Yeah, you're exactly right. They did not see beyond the moments of these choices, because if they had, they wouldn't have let these people live. In fact, you go back to Numbers 33, and you don't have to flip back here, but the end of that section, after God tells them how to divide up the inheritance, one of the things he says is, but if you do not drive out the inhabitants of the land from before you, then those of them whom you let remain shall be as barbs in your eyes and thorns in your side, and they shall trouble you in the land where you dwell. And I will do to you as I thought to do to them. That's a promise from God. And yet, the people are, in their minds, devising these thoughts of, well, it doesn't really matter. I don't know exactly how they got to this point, why they didn't. I wanted to think about that because human nature can easily rationalize it because they did. But their failure is going to set them up for worse failure in the future, just like God promised. They're going to be the downfall of you. Okay, I saw a couple of hands here.
So I just wanted to, I think it's a great comment from Jessica, that you keep in mind too, though, that those things are inseparably linked.
Okay.
The idols that exist. Even if they did destroy all the idols and let the people stay, the idols would just come back.
Yeah, that's a great point.
You know what I'm saying? It's from, the idol is from the heart of those people, or created from the heart of those people.
It's a reflection of those people.
So that's why they were to destroy all those people. Don't leave anybody, and don't leave the idols there, because obviously if they have the idols there, now it comes down to the of others, so
Yeah.
It was everything had to be wiped
That's a
out.
great point. Yeah, and if you know the history of Israel, that's what we see, right? They don't put the idols away, and that's what leads to their downfall. That this failure is why they end up in captivity. These pockets of people, it seems so insignificant in the moment, I'm sure. But this subtle failure, this subtle disobedience is really what it is, led them away from God one step to this place where now they're worshiping other gods Now they're being taken captive by other nations. Now they find themselves going, where is our God? And it points back to this. It points back to this. Dennis?
I think some of it, I've always heard from others, is that human nature, human being being just at war at all.
Sure.
all the time. And they're looking forward to settling the land, and that's in the forefront of their mind.
Yeah.
And you can spend year after year fighting, it wears on.
Sure.
And it says, they could not force them out of the cities.
That's right.
Well, it means they just basically weren't really trying to force them out of the cities. If they'd been faithful to God, God would have forced them out of the
That's
cities.
right.
But I think there's a fatigue there.
Yeah, I mean, you ever get tired of fighting the battle Satan wages against you? I know I sure do. There's sometimes like, God, how long, right? Isn't that the question of all the faith? How long do I have to endure this? How long is this going to go on? And keep in mind, the people are winning, but, these are long campaigns. They're traveling a lot, and you're going against, they're still fighting giants in some places. I mean, this is an exhausting thing. And I think you're exactly right, Dennis. It's easy for people to get mentally fatigued, to lose their focus, but what that leads to is disobedience, and we need to understand that. Them not destroying these people was disobedience because God told them to. And it was for their good. And they still didn't do it. No? Dennis covered it. All right, Michael?
Yeah, I think you mentioned that, had they been able to see the consequences of this down the road,
Sure.
it would change. I think that kind of speaks to our argument too. We often occasionally justify something that's not that bad.
Sure.
Or that, well, you get an edge. And I think that with the Bible teaches us over and over and over, that's all the devil needs is just an edge. Once you give that snowballs much, something much greater than you gave it.
Yeah.
Then, captivity, it always snowballs.
Yeah, this is the wisdom of the Proverbs. There's a way that seems right to us. There's a way that seems right to us. This is the practical application. There's a way that seems right to us. And maybe it doesn't end poorly in our generation. Maybe it does, But when we don't look beyond the moment, we're making terrible choices. We have to be people who look beyond the moment. But more than that, who look to divine wisdom and recognize our forethought, our foresight, our vision of the future is so limited. When we don't operate with divine vision and in obedience to the divine, we're setting ourselves up for failure. My guess is they could never have foreseen how bad it was. But God told them it was going to get this way. That's the worst part about all this, is they knew, they were warned. And they still did it. Ruth?
But they've got the land and they're ready to inhabit the land. They're ready to do they're done with the fighting. They're ready to
Sure. Settle down and be home.
settle down and build their lives again.
Yeah, that's a great point. And perhaps that's some of the motivation too. We just want to get to something normal. We've been nomads for 400 years. Getting close to 5. I can imagine, you get that again. I think fatigue comes into that, wanting to be settled. But perhaps this is a warning for us. This world is not our home. We're just passing through, right? Our treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. Perhaps something for us to consider. I just wanted to draw out this idea, though, about small disobedience. It's not insignificant. I think, in fact, it's really emphasized by the contrast that we're given in Joshua's obedience to God, right? Joshua was utterly faithful to God, to Moses' directives. I don't know if you noticed this in chapter 13 and chapter 14 especially. Moses is kind of pushed back to the forefront. The commands that Moses gave for the inheritances, for how they were supposed to handle things. In verse number 8, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave from them. Verse number 14, to the tribe of Levi alone, Moses gave no inheritance. And so Joshua is enforcing these things that Moses had spoken so long ago. And this is a very subtle, simple pattern, but this is what faithful people do, right? They obey God and they follow the patterns of those before them that they knew were faithful. Isn't that who we're trying to be? Hebrews chapter 11, we're trying to walk in the steps of the faithful and obey God and follow their words and their examples. That's what we see from Joshua. And so that's what Joshua does. He is faithful in giving the inheritances. He is faithful in doing things God's way. And we'll talk about that more in just a second. But first I want to talk about Levi. We just read that verse in Joshua chapter 13 and verse number 14. To the tribe of Levi alone, Moses gave no inheritance. The offerings by fire to the Lord God of Israel are their inheritance. And this is kind of a focal point in this section. I don't know if you picked up on that. It's mentioned in chapter 13. It's mentioned in chapter 14. Chapter 21 is really all about the Levites' place that they would live at. We can't call it an inheritance because he says they have no inheritance, but they are certainly given some cities. But there's two very key statements that are made here in this verse that I just read. The first is that the offerings by fire to the Lord are their inheritance. What exactly does that mean? I ask you to think about this in question number 2. What exactly does that mean? That is their inheritance. I'm sorry, say that again?
They'll eat of the sacrifices.
Okay, so they'll receive the blessings of what is given from the people. Okay, what else? What else does that mean, you think? The inheritance, the offerings by fire to the Lord God of Israel are their inheritance.
It'll be their responsibility.
Okay. So you think about all these other tribes are getting land that they're going to pass down and pass down and pass down, right? That's their future that their kids get. But the Levites, they're not passing down something tangible like land. They're passing down this relationship, this responsibility, right? For generations, the Levites are going to be the ones who make sure or are supposed to ensure that the law is fulfilled, that the sacrifices are taking place, that people are drawing near to God. Isn't that the role of the Levites, right? They draw near to God for the people. They're special among the nation for that reason. And so this role of serving and drawing near to God, that's their legacy that they're going to pass down to their kids. And not only that, that's going to be their identity, right? Throughout the generations. You know, in the Old Covenant, they were respected, they were taken care of because of their role given by God. And I think you kind of hinted that, or Linda, you hinted at this. They were given the best portions, right? The best portions are going to God's sacrifice, but then they get to eat a part of that. That's their inheritance. And so their inheritance is not necessarily what they're given, but who they're given, who they get to be related to. And so the way I understand this, especially having the Levites scattered throughout the land, they are just a very present reminder that having a land of your own doesn't make you special to God. Right? And really, it was never about the land that God was giving them. I mean, that was definitely a fulfillment and a critical part of the process. But what really made them special was God gave them this land, right? And the Levites were there to remind the people, knowing God, being identified with God. That's the most valuable inheritance that we can have as the people of God. Jamie?
Well, there might be other verses, but Deuteronomy 10:9 and then Joshua 13:33 specifically says that the Lord is their inheritance.
The Lord is their inheritance, yeah.
And what greater inheritance than any of us, right?
That's exactly right.
Well,
Well, and wouldn't you agree? That's what we're supposed to see about our lives today. We are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 10. We are priests to God who receive our inheritance by being accepted into his family, being allowed to draw near to God with confidence, as the writer of Hebrews would say in chapter 10. I want to draw this out because we've got to learn to appreciate and find joy in the inheritance that God has promised us. You know, it is no small thing that God accepts us into his family, into the household of God. Right? That is significant. God is saying, you get to be one of mine. I'm not just giving you something. You are my child. We have been given every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places. Ephesians chapter 1, right? You know that whole section? We've been given an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, unfading, kept in heaven for us, 1 Peter chapter 1, who's by God's powers being guarded by grace, ready to be revealed in the last time. I mean, those are the promises of inheritance. That's the language of Joshua that is being imposed on us today because we are supposed to be like these Levites. We're scattered throughout the world, and yet we belong to God, and he is our inheritance throughout all generations. That's what we're passing down. We're not passing down a land that God has given to us. We're passing down a legacy of knowing God and being God's people. Yes, ma'am.
The Levites were scattered all through the land because their duty
was to teach the people. And
Sure.
we have the same duty to teach those around us.
Yeah.
So that they either come to God or return to God.
Hey, you impose all the things of the book of Leviticus on this and the holiness that they're supposed to display. You're exactly right. That's the language that's applied to us. We're supposed to be holy representatives of God in this world, offering our lives as daily sacrifices so that people can know God and draw near to God because of who we are. This world is not our home. And they had no home. They had lands and they had places to stay, but they were a very present reminder of that. Great thoughts there. Any final thoughts about the Levitical, the Levites in their land? We get into chapter 21, and we're not going to have time to really go through it today. But they come to Joshua and they say, God promised to give us some land. And so they are given land that's kind of scattered throughout, but they aren't given any official inheritance in that. Okay, yeah, go ahead, Bobby.
I would just make the comment that the priest was a special calling from God.
Sure.
And so that holy special calling, consider what that's worth compared to those who inherited the land.
Sure. Yeah, great point. And again, we're called today as well, and it's special and it's holy. Nick?
So did the people, when the people sinned and they were bringing a sacrifice, did they have to bring the sacrifice to Jerusalem, or did they bring the sacrifice to the priest, to the Levite that was living among them? I guess
Sure.
I mean, did they have to bring the sacrifice to a central location for the priest to do it, or could any Levite receive their offering and?
Sure. At this point in the history of the nation, I'm not sure that is clearly defined yet. I would assume that it would have to be where the tabernacle was, or the temple, because obviously you're offering them on the altars and things like that. I do, if I recall, in the book of Judges, I think that there are some episodes where they try to bring offerings to Levites in other places, and Judges is just trying to show us how backwards and upside down everything is, and so I would assume that that's not the proper way to do it. But yeah, I don't know. I need to think about that. I hadn't really pondered that one, but my assumption would be, God's promise to Israel is that there's going to be a place where He makes His name dwell and where He wants to be worshipped, and I would assume that Jerusalem would be that place, or wherever the temple tabernacle was.
So the Levites that were living throughout the land, their task was to just keep proclaiming. They were like a preacher that was proclaiming God's message, and then they would take the sacrifices.
Yeah, when you think about in the prophets, one of the great indictments of the prophets is that you priests have not communicated to my people who I am and how to know me, right? And that my people die for lack of knowledge, right? Hosea 4. And so they had this very significant responsibility. And God condemns the people, right? But it's always like the priests and the kings, they fail. They both failed. You didn't lead properly my people to be prosperous. You didn't lead my people to know me spiritually. And the nation fell apart. And that's why when Jesus comes up, we need, a better high priest. We need a better king. And so, yeah, there's definitely that onus on them to help the people know God. I think that's a great point.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because it is something that's kind of unknown. It's not fully explained to us, but I think it's pretty clear that they were it's pretty clear in the scriptures. The people were sacrificing to God before the Israelite nation ever existed. You look at Job.
Sure.
He was sacrificing for his children in case they had sinned, So offering sacrifices to God was something that wouldn't have been new to them when the Mosaic law came. We were already doing that. But now it's going to be made part of this special law to the Jews, the Jewish nation. But it does seem to suggest, though I don't think it can be conclusive, that there were sacrifices going on besides those at the temple or tabernacle. But interesting question, though.
I'll look into that a little bit more. That's 2 weeks in a row you've given me a question I can't answer, so stop that.
They had some practical things that they were called to do also through the Levitical system. If you had leprosy, you had to go to the priest and other things like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Obviously, they're important for being throughout the people and drawing that attention back to God. I think this is important because the people got caught up in the land. And isn't the nation of Israel today, what are they caught up in? This is our land that God gave to us. And they're completely missing God, right? And that, I think, was part of this draw here. I want you to remember you're a people special to me because you know me, not because I gave you this piece of dirt, right? Again, an important piece of dirt at this point in history, but was not the end all. It's a foreshadowing of the land that he's going to give them. All right, we got to move along. Let me talk for just a minute about Judah's inheritance. So Judah is the first one that's brought up. After we talk about the eastern tribes, they start giving out the allotments for the western tribes. And Judah is the largest tribe, and therefore given the largest land area. And again, this was per Moses because they were the largest tribe. But it also seems to me that their inheritance corresponds to their role in the Bible story. If you're familiar with the Genesis story, obviously Joseph is a significant character there, but Judah is actually the one driving the story forward in the book of Genesis. When as he he has his really ugly moment there in Genesis 38. But then he grows through it to the point where he's the one that is encouraging his father and his family to come to Egypt. He promises to protect Benjamin at the cost of his own life. Judah becomes kind of the prominent figure. In fact, whenever you get to Genesis chapter 49 and Jacob is making promises, Judah is the one that gets the kingly promise. It says in Genesis 49 and verse number 10, the scepter shall not depart from between your feet. In other words, kings are going to come from you. And what tribe did Jesus come from? The tribe of Judah. And so he's been positioned there. And I think this giving of the inheritance, this larger inheritance, foreshadows some of those things. Some of that may be speculative, but it's something worth considering. And I want to say this because there's a lot of promises being fulfilled in their reception of this large inheritance. Because Judah is going to become really this hub of the nation. Even after it divides all the way into captivity, Judah is kind of the core piece of the nation of Israel. And as their inheritance is being given, they're here in chapter 14, another key figure comes back to the spotlight. Y'all remember who is from the tribe of Judah who comes and asks for his inheritance? Caleb, one of the two token old guys here in Israel again, right? Him and Joshua, you think about it, they're the only two old guys that are left from the wilderness years. Everybody else died. Caleb's 85 years old. But he doesn't act like an 85-year-old man. I mean, I'm really impressed, and we're supposed to see his spirit here. You know, he still believes in the promises of God, and he wants to fulfill them. And I think his example here is so important. He's not growing old and giving up. Caleb's language here, I want you to listen to this. Beginning in the end of verse number 6, you know, the Lord said to Moses, the man of God in Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me, I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought him word again as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt. Yet I wholly followed the Lord. And Moses swore on that day, surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. And now, so this is him at 85 years old. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, just as he said these 45 years, since the time that the Lord spoke this word to Moses while Israel walked in the wilderness. And behold, now, I am this day 85 years old. I am still as strong today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength now is as my strength was then for war and for going and coming. So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day. For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord has said. A couple things I want you to notice about what Caleb has to say here. I mean, don't you just feel his energy and his spirit and his confidence as he's talking here? I still want to go and fight because God has promised us this. I am going to conquer this because I believe. In fact, his language there at the very end is very interesting. You know, as he's saying, I'm going to go fight them, he says, it may be that the Lord will be with me and I shall drive them out. I don't think there's any doubt in there. Please don't hear me wrong on that. But he still has this appreciation that it doesn't matter who I'm fighting against. If God is for me, who can be against me? He is strong, he is courageous, he is not afraid because he knows that the Lord goes with him wherever he goes. And who are the people? Think about this. The land that he asks to inherit, who inhabits that land currently?
Giants.
The giants. So here's an 85-year-old man saying, I want the land of the giants. I want to go take them on. I want you to think about this with me. Moses was a giant killer, killed Og and Sihon. Joshua was a giant killer. Caleb was a giant killer. I think there's something profound that we're supposed to see from these faithful men who are stepping up. They were giant killers, but they also very clearly understood, I can't defeat giants by myself. God's the one who's going to defeat the giants. And these men are kind of set forward as examples. This is what godly men ought to look like. This is what godly leaders ought to look like. And that kind of fades as you get into the book of the Judges, especially you get into stories like Gideon, who's a cowardly man, and these people who are not good godly leaders, that kind of wanes. But then you come back to the time of the kings, and once again, God's people are faced with a giant, Goliath. And David steps up and says, I'm not going to defeat you on my own. I'm going to defeat you by the power of the living God. Could you defy the armies of the living? Faithfulness is we are willing to stand in the face of giants because we realize it's not our strength. It's the strength of God behind us. We're supposed to see that through these examples. We will never defeat giants on our own. Ever. We're not supposed to look at the story of David and say, man, he beat Goliath. No. He stood against Goliath because he trusted in God. And we face Goliaths in our life. We face giants in our life. We will never defeat them on our own unless we say, I can do this with God. I can be strong and courageous and not be afraid because the Lord is with me wherever I go. We're supposed to see faithful people are giant killers because they stand with God in the strength of God. I asked you this in question number 4, were there any other details about Caleb's inheritance that you noticed or that stood out to you as you read? There was kind of 2 sections here, chapter 14, also chapter 15, there was a small section there. Anything else that stood out to you about Caleb and his inheritance that was given? Well, I want to point out to you that within the context of Joshua and Caleb, we're introduced to another man who doesn't fear the giants. Chapter 15 and verse number 17, a man named Othniel. So Caleb makes this challenge. He says, whoever will come and take this land from the Anakim, I'll give him my daughter. This man Othniel, he steps up. He's not afraid of the giants. Now, in the context of the story, I think we're kind of supposed to see, is this going to be the guy that's going to step up and be the next leader of Israel? Well, if you know how the story goes, Othniel would actually go on to be the first judge of Israel. He doesn't take the reins of leadership, but I think it's important to highlight that he makes an appearance here as a giant killer. Because giant killers are faithful people who trust in God, and he's going to be the first one to deliver God's people and bring rest. The other thing I want you to notice from the story of Caleb is back in chapter 14, the last statement of chapter 14, it says, and the land had rest from war. That's the same phrase that was used of Joshua when they finished the conquest in chapter 11 and verse number 23. And I think that what this wants us to see is that under faithful leadership, rest is possible among the people of God and the promises of God. Listen, when we have faithful, godly men leading us, there is rest and there is peace. And don't we experience some of that in this church? We have good, faithful, godly leaders. Look, let me plug on our elders for just a minute. We have good, faithful, godly men who are leading us to know God, to fight these battles. And don't we experience peace in this church because of that? That is not by accident. That is by God's design. When faithful men lead, there is peace in the church. And thank God that we have that. Thank God that we have that. Because you know what you're going to see in Judges? That's going to go away. And chaos is going to ensue. And people's lives are going to be wrecked. And there's not peace among the people of God. Peace is possible when godly men lead. So thank you guys. I just want to make sure y'all hear that from me this morning. It'll make me cry this morning. All right, we'll pick up some of this in our next class. I know this was kind of drinking out of a fire hose. We'll pick up a little bit more as we go into next week. Thank y'all for your thoughts and attention this morning. Go ahead.